person first language encourages essentially distancing the person or the individual from disability. For, I think a lot of reasons. We have been socialized, disabled and non-disabled people alike, to believe disability is negative, something to be hidden, something, that's kind of riddled with stigma. And I would say out of the political correctness movement of the 1980s and 90s, we were taught not to identify as disabled or to identify others as disabled, but, really recognizing I'm a person first.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea. Today, we are discussing better practices for serving students with disabilities with 3 scholars, student affairs educators, and a leader in the field of disability studies. Before I introduce my guest today, I'm going to share a little bit more about our podcast and today's sponsors. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Today's episode is sponsored by Simplicity. A true partner, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. This episode is also sponsored by Leadershape. Go to leadershape.org to learn how they can work with you to create a just, caring, and thriving world. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for a little bit more information on each of these sponsors. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from East Lansing, Michigan, on the campus of Michigan State University. MSU occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. The university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. I am so grateful to the 3 folks who have joined me today to talk with us and our audience. So I would love each of you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your connection to this episode's topic, a little bit about your background. And I'm going to start with Lissa. Welcome, Lissa.
Hi. Hello, my name is Dr. Lissa Ramirez Stapleton. She, her, and her pronouns. I live, work on the ancestral, traditional, contemporary lands of the Tongva people. So I'm in Southern California, Riverside, LA area. I'm an associate professor of deaf studies at Cal State Northridge and a core faculty member in the Education, Leadership, and Policy Studies program. My research primarily focuses on deaf communities, looking at identity, history, access, and language.
Thank you. Welcome. And Amanda, welcome to Student Affairs Now. You were on a previous episode of Student Affairs Live, which we'll talk a little bit about. So it's great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you all too. Thanks for having me. I'm Dr. Amanda Krause. I use she, her pronouns. I'm at the University of Arizona in Tucson, which resides on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Pascua Yaqui and Tohono O'odham communities. At the U of A, I'm Assistant Vice President for Campus Life and Executive Director for the Disability Resource Center. And I'm an Associate Professor of Practice in the Center for the Study of Higher Education, where I teach in our master's program, student services courses, as well as disability and higher ed courses. And I am finishing up my term right now as the president for AHEAD, the Association on Higher Education and Disability. And it's lovely to be with you all.
Thanks for being here, Amanda. And Autumn, welcome.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Wilkie. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm joining you today from the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Oceti-Sakowin and the Meskwak and Meskwaki peoples, which is central Iowa, for folks who are not familiar with where I work. I work as the Associate Chief Diversity Officer for Disability Resources at Grinnell College, which is a small private liberal arts school of about 1,600 students in Iowa. And I'm also a doctoral student at Colorado State University, where my research really is focusing on the experiences of disabled students, particularly within the classroom.
Excellent. And I have ties to Colorado State, and then of course back to the University of Arizona. So it's great to hear that connection piece. And Lissa, I know our paths crossed several years ago. I think
Always,
ACPA. Yeah,
always.
I love it. So this episode was actually initially sparked by a previous episode I hosted last semester about pronouns. And I think the conversation or comment on the YouTube recording was, can you do another conversation about language, but with respect to disability? So we're going to start there today, but take this in all kinds of other directions so that we can all better learn and serve students on our campuses. And as you could tell, this is a complete rock star panel from administrative leaders and faculty and scholars and folks who are contributing to the literature, as well as serving in professional association leadership roles. So I am grateful, and I have no doubt this is going to be a fascinating conversation. So I'd love to begin with the topic of language, always evolving. What recent changes have occurred? And Amanda, I'm going to toss this to you first.
Sure. Yeah, language is a really interesting topic, and I know folks have a lot of questions about disability language. And so I can share with you a recent document and direction that AHEAD has gone in to promote identity first language. But before I do, I want to kind of, discuss options. So person first and identity first language, and I welcome my colleagues to jump in as well. Person first language is I'm a person with a disability. And I do want to take a minute to say that I'm disabled and use a wheelchair, and this might not be apparent from YouTube or the podcast, but these conversations are both personally and professionally very important to me. Person first language encourages essentially distancing the person or the individual from disability. For, I think a lot of reasons. We have been socialized, disabled and non-disabled people alike, to believe disability is negative, something to be hidden, something, that's kind of riddled with stigma. And I would say out of the political correctness movement of the 1980s and 90s, we were taught not to identify as disabled or to identify others as disabled, but, really recognizing I'm a person first. Identity first language challenges that a bit. And, an example of identity first language, I've been modeling it, is I'm disabled. I'm a disabled person. Mm. That language, I would say, is more consistent with disability studies, more consistent with perhaps social justice, thinking about access and equity, and is, in my opinion, a bit more accurate in that I believe I am a person with an impairment who is disabled by attitudes, structures, systemic barriers. For me, it's also more consistent with how I identify with other parts of myself. I'm a woman. I am a disabled woman. I am a disabled white woman. I do not feel the need to distance myself from other subordinated identities that I hold. And I do want to, just kind of say, to clarify that that's my choice. I've done a lot of work and reflecting on my disability identity and how best to represent it in language. There are lots of people who prefer person first or might use the approaches interchangeably. And, I certainly think it's important to leave space for that. AHEAD recently, just about a year ago, a little over a year ago, issued a statement basically saying that as an organization, we would be promoting identity first language, and we're working to update all of our communication across our websites and various channels to reflect identity first language. It is not a directive, it is not the rules, and if you don't follow it, you're out. It's simply a position we're taking to model identity first language, because I think as much as we've all been trained to utilize person first language, there are a lot of people who want to say disabled and who want to say disability and aren't sure if it's appropriate. So AHEAD is trying to kind of get out there and say it is okay to say disabled. it's also okay to say person with a disability. I'll say it, it's not okay with me to use euphemisms like differently abled or special needs or handy capable, mentally challenged. And I'm sure we could talk more about that if necessary, but I think it's important to say disability, both person first and identity first language. You know, they are articulating the word disability. And personally, I lean a little bit more on the identity first side, and ahead is simply, I think, creating space for that in the profession.
We are going to share that statement with the show notes today, so folks will be able to access and read through it. But what else would you all add, Lissa or Autumn?
I think it's really interesting because I think it's I have the pleasure to work for Rankin and Associates and to do climate studies all over the country, and have had a lot of time with students, and to focus on disability. And I think the language piece is in line with how people are feeling about being visible. So when talking with students, I want to have a club. I want to have, a space that I can identify my disability openly, right? And running up against all of the kind of older ways of thinking of things need to be secretive, people don't need to know. Running up against, I think, the ways in which the system pushes shame, right? And I think students are pushing back saying, no, I want to chat with other students who have a variety of disabilities. I want to be in community. I want people to know. I want to table a tent when other clubs are tabling tents. I want to recruit people and be involved and be in community and conversation with people. So I think that our policies and practices are finally kind of getting in line with what students really want. So I feel like it's a little more parallel. I mean, we're getting there, right? It's like pushing the parallels of what students want and what our system has not always allowed them to have. For a variety of laws and rules and policies and practices we put into place to protect them, right? And they're saying, no, I don't actually want you to protect me. Like, I think I'm okay. And I want to be in community with other folks. So I'm excited to see that Ahead is leading the way with that. And I guess in community also with, I think, disability justice folks in the community who have been pushing this and saying, like, this is who we are as a person with a learning disability. This is who I am. Like, there's no need to like sugarcoat that or hide that under something else. But I think, again, the academy, community, ground, social justice advocates work and students are finally starting to get in the same rhythm and vibe, which is cool to see.
Yeah, and I would really echo everything that Amanda and Lissa have already said. And I think the piece that I would add is kind of thinking too about, as I'm working with, like, I do a number of trainings on campus, and language is often one of the places where folks have questions, faculty, staff, other students across the board. And, and I think one of the things that I always emphasize for folks is that, we can have sort of shared language for policy, for process, but like, ultimately everybody has their own sort of personal, and like that the best thing you can do is also to respect how other people identify themselves. And I often will then, sort of for myself, like share, some of my own preferences around language. I also identify as disabled. But I talk about how our language is imperfect and share the specific example that, like, when I talk about community, when I talk about the communities I'm a part of, I really use language of disabled. But when I'm talking more specifically about my diagnoses and things like that, like, so I have OCD, and I will talk about, I'm a person with OCD, but I'm part of the disabled community. And so that even in the ways that sometimes as you get into the nuance of some of those pieces of it, like our sentence structures don't always work with the ways that people actually want to talk about themselves or refer to themselves. And so kind of talking through some of those things, and that it's really about people having the choice and the agency to identify for themselves what language fits, what language feels right. And as somebody who's also part of the queer community, I think that feels really like natural to me too, in the ways that the language that one person who might seemingly identify the same as me uses for them may not work for me, and the language that I use for myself works really well for me, and actually is what I feel like describes my experience. And so I often will try to give some of those examples as I'm talking with folks to kind of help really really talk about the ways that there's not a one right answer that fits for everybody, because our language doesn't always provide options for that, and everybody's experience is different. And so people are going to have different words that really resonate for them in terms of how they talk about their experience, their relationship with disability, their relationship with others within disabled communities. All of that may shift and change based on location, based on sort of where somebody's at in their identity development, like across the board. All of that can be stuff that shifts.
So what I'm hearing is I'm now seeing many parallels between the conversation around pronouns, right? So really about allowing the person and asking them what they prefer, and using the language as well as creating the communities of belonging where folks can connect with one another. And so I'm like, oh, maybe that's what the person who was thinking about was getting at, specifically around asking the individual. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your work on your respective campuses. And, certainly 2022 is where we are, right now, but the last couple of years of the pandemic has certainly changed the ways that we engage with one another, both in technology and virtual spaces, but also on our campuses. So would love to hear more about how has anything changed, in the way that you're engaging with students, and what are some of the bigger challenges facing students on our campuses who identify as disabled or members of the disability community? And I'll maybe start with Autumn.
Yeah, I think, sort of my initial thought, or the first thing that kind of came to mind as you were explaining the question, is that I don't think we fully know yet. I think a lot of that is still like a lot of the ways that pandemic has shaped sort of experiences, the ways that the pandemic is continuing to shape experiences, I think is stuff that we will continue to see sort of shape out over the next 2 to however many years for students. But some of the things that I've seen on, in particular on our campus, like comparing sort of pre-pandemic, during pandemic, in this ongoing period of, like kind of thinking about all these different phases. A couple of the observations that I've made and that I think remain to be seen, if how this will be a good thing, a complicated thing, kind of across the board. One of them being that folks who have, I would say, never really, who had not previously disclosed or who had not previously been seeking disability communities, for the first time, really, there were folks who were doing that because of the pandemic. I think there were ways where folks who may have, I'm thinking in particular, some of the folks that I work with, both on the faculty staff side and on the student side, who have complicated sort of chronic health conditions and may not have previously identified as being part of a disability or the disabled community. Really, I think for the first time, we're finding, like this is something that the pandemic is forcing me to kind of reckon with isn't even the right word, but like to tell other people about and begin to come into community around some of it. I think that there's been a lot of ways where, particularly for folks who are navigating sort of being immunocompromised, masking, like all of these things on college campuses are starting to find each other and talk about those experiences in a way that I'm excited about. I'm excited about the ways that some of our conversation about what does community and support for each other kind of look like has been shifting on our campus over the course of the pandemic, both because of who's getting engaged in that conversation, people who previously had not been, but then also I think the pandemic, and Lissa may have some ways to contribute on this. I think that there's ways where the pandemic really has both illuminated opportunities for bringing folks into the conversation and have isolated people. I think that there's ways where technology has been great, and there prior to the pandemic had been lots of disabled folks and activists sort of pushing for more ways for remote and hybrid participation in things. But I think we've also seen ways where where if the technology isn't right, if the captions aren't there, if the video is not good, if the audio connections, like where it's just further continuing to separate folks, and really that some of the same principles pre-pandemic like applied in terms of like what sort of like care and sort of thought is going into sort of the anticipation of disabled people within spaces, and not just sort of an afterthought of like, well, how can we, now that somebody has raised this as an issue, how can we bring somebody in, or how can we be thinking about this? And so I think there's lots of things that the last couple of years have not necessarily changed, but have illuminated, like have made more sort of forefront in terms of conversations and things like that, certainly on our campus anyway.
Yeah, Alyssa, what would you add?
So as I said, I'm a faculty member in deaf studies. And so I work with a diverse group of students, right? So not all deaf students, so deaf and hearing students, but we've been online for 2 years now. We're online again this semester, where I think most of our campus, like 75–80% of the campus is back, but we could not navigate the mask situation. So with masks, with our interpreters in our classes, so I sign all my classes. We have kind of full immersion for our courses, but then some certain classes have interpreters, and couldn't get around do we do clear masks? What do we do when they fog up and students actually still can't see your lips? Folks having a hard time breathing with them. The communication piece, we couldn't figure out the communication piece to come back this semester. And so we are still online with some really positive things, right? Around, I think there are certain students who were not participating before that are finding a space to be able to participate through chat, right? Or enjoying the smaller kind of spaces, folks who are navigating anxiety, like this has been a positive thing. On the flip side, technology has been huge. So if I'm signing and students are seeing my hands 4 and 5 times because of whatever weird internet connection are happening, communication takes longer, right? I think it's really exhausting to be able to kind of take in all the information in this way, because everything has to kind of slow down. I think our interpreters have been phenomenal, but it's been a learning curve to figure out the technology piece. Who are we lighting? Who's not being lit? I mean, like, who's pinning? Who's not being? I mean, like, there's been a learning curve. I also think when working with a variety of students with disabilities, there is some type of disconnect for certain students through the screen, that like either information, students either can't feel my energy, or just, there's literally certain students I have to meet with every day after class, and I have to repeat whatever I've said in certain parts of the class because it just didn't come through, which I don't even fully know. I have a feeling about it, but I don't fully know how to communicate what's happening for folks. But there is a disconnect for some people, like the information, I just can't understand what you're saying to me, right? And so it's a lot of kind of repeating and meeting one-on-one, and let me try to say it in a different way. Let me give you a visual, let me give you this, right? And so that's a different teaching, right? That's a different approach to teaching. That's a different amount of like energy and time that you're spending one-on-one. I have about 120 students. And so, I would say a large, the number of students with disabilities in my class, in terms of what you were saying, Autumn, in terms of identifying, is doubled, easily doubled. I think even still, we're almost in week 8 and I'm still getting students added to my roster of students who are getting accommodations, right? Because they're just like, I'm not doing well, I need help, right? And so I think I'm seeing more and more, and that it just impacts teaching, right? And to flip that, most faculty are not trained on how best to work with diverse students, big picture, right? Disabled students, really, in terms of technology, in terms of what does accessibility means, and then to go beyond that, like what does it mean to sit down and have a conversation about feeling included, making sure your curriculum is diverse and includes people, making sure you have presenters in class that are representative of the diversity that's in your class, right? It's the next step. I don't think universal design feels accessible, which is kind of odd to faculty all the time. Like, what, I get it, but what do I do with it in my class? How do I turn this into math? How do I turn this into philosophy? How do I turn this into sociology? Like, I understand it in theory. It's great in theory, but in practice, I don't think there's a lot of like kind of case study, hands-on, like this is what it actually means in your course. This is how it plays out in your course. This is what it looks like in a one-on-one conversation with a student. I don't think that that's there yet. And I think people have tried really hard during the pandemic to give lots of like professional development on how to use Canvas and Blackboard and all the different systems. But I don't think that's always turned into, this is how you work one-on-one with students around grief and learning differently and not being able to feel and understand their professors, and navigating home, and like all these other things that are playing into students' lives in terms of learning on top of disability. right? That those pieces, which I can go on and on, because I don't always think necessarily that faculty have been taken care of well to be able to come into the classroom, because we're dealing with our own stuff, right? We're coming in with all of our own stuff and trying to be a support system for folks. But I just think it's complicated. I think it's complicated. And I wouldn't say that it's not working for everyone, and it's working for a lot of people too, right? So I think it's just like face-to-face classes. When we go back in the fall, I think it's going to be great for some people and not great for other folks. And I think it's just important to have conversations, real conversations about that.
Yeah. Amanda, what conversations are you having, or what would you contribute?
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of what Lissa and Autumn have already discussed. I think at Arizona, it's a very large campus, and so it's not uncommon for us to have about 4,000 students affiliated with our office utilizing accommodations, and that has held. But I will say that, like I think Lissa said, later and later into the semester, people are still affiliating, they're still requesting accommodations. We also do workplace access and accommodations for employees. And not surprisingly, we've seen hundreds more faculty and staff making requests for COVID-related accommodations. And so, students are saying, we're not prepared to be here, or we're not prepared to straddle the remote in-person environment. And I think that's true for most students, most faculty and staff, and it might kind of show up differently for students with disabilities. I've said many times in the last couple of years, the pandemic has exposed a lot of deeply embedded assumptions we have about what is a student, where is the classroom, what is an academic, what is a professional. Ultimately exposed a lot of ableism in the academy, right? Certainly from my position, the things that we are now doing regularly, flexible schedules, flexible deadlines, remote class opportunities, captions, auto-generated captions, professional captions, accessible electronic materials. Previously, prior to the pandemic, those were all reserved for individual accommodations, which meant that disabled people had to request them, wait on them, right? Go through a very different process than their non-disabled peers and counterparts. And now that everyone was impacted, our university and every other college and university kind of sprung into action and required faculty to be more flexible, right? Be more innovative. And, I will take that as a kind of win for universal design. I think we've grown a lot. We're way better at it now, 2 years in, than we were in March of 2020. But, it is a reminder of kind of values and assumptions, I would say, that really underlie higher education. And I don't think that there's any checklist or way to guarantee that you're doing it right. I mean, we've had ADA compliance for 30 years, and that doesn't mean, even though something's accessible, it doesn't mean it's inclusive or welcoming or certainly equitable, right? And just because we've universally designed something doesn't mean that we are not going to have to work individually with people. So neither one of these approaches to access are, going to work perfectly for everyone. And I think that's more in line with the spirit of UD, of universal design, and that options, flexibility, choice, right, are real priorities. And I think we've definitely seen that, right? We've put those values into practice. And there's still individual accommodations that we need to make.
Yeah. We could go in so many different directions. Kind of imagining us going down the path of, what does universal design look like in student affairs work? But I really want to pick up also on this kind of systemic institutional role as well. So, when we think about, serving students broadly, but really how our institutions need to be not just thinking about compliance, but really thinking about equity. What are some of the suggestions that you have, or what role has AHEAD maybe played, Amanda? I'll stay with you for a moment in promoting that institutional responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen a real shift in AHEAD, and it's, the priorities of our members, the professional development that we've offered over the years. I've been affiliated with AHEAD for 12 or 15 years, somewhere thereabouts. And, when I first affiliated, it was very much a medical model. How do we help? How do we fix? Very much, I would say, gatekeepers to accommodations. And in the last few years, that has really changed in that we're having more conversations about access and social justice, the history of oppression that disabled and deaf people share, disability cultural centers. And I think we do a lot more, kind of to support conversation on good outreach, right? So I say this a lot, but if you're a disability resource office and all you do is respond to requests for individual accommodations, that's all you're ever going to do. And that is out of the control of most DR or DS professionals. That's how they're resourced, how they're organized. But one thing that we do at Arizona, which I think is very important, and we're certainly not the only ones to do this, but we have some positions that are really campus facing. They do not work primarily with individuals, whether students or employees, on accommodations. They work with campus partners on informing the design of a more inclusive campus that would reduce or potentially eliminate the need for accommodations. So, we say a lot, you always have to work both sides of the fence. We are the compliance area, right? We do compliance work. And you can meet your compliance obligations through a universal design approach. You can remove a barrier systemically rather than individually, putting a quick fix on something, and it's still compliant. It's a shift in how we think about access. But I think that there's lots of great opportunity there. I mean, looking forward into the future, the ADA has been around for 30 years, but so the next 30 years, I hope we're able to really operationalize the spirit of that law in creating inclusive and welcoming communities. We work with students who have been admitted to colleges and universities by the same standards and practices. They're in the classroom, they're held to the same academic standards, on campus, held to the same behavioral standards, yet, disabled students have to do a lot more to get the same basic access that non-disabled students just get by virtue of showing up. So, something that we like to talk about a lot in AHEAD and at Arizona is how do we ensure a similar, if not identical, experience on campus? And that's in the classroom and outside the classroom. Everything that campus has to offer, similar, if not identical, for disabled and non-disabled students with respect to access.
Yeah, and I kind of building off of that, I think one of the things, and it gets at this not only just the institutional sort of obligation part, but also that every person on the campus plays a part in it too, kind of building off of that, what Amanda was saying about the additional sort of barriers and time and all of, and I think one of the things that, I think it takes a while or there needs to continue to be education around is that many of those things are not physical. Many of those things are the ways that people use spaces or the ways that people, like it's the ableism or the ways that we construct sort of environments. And I think on our campus, we have buildings that need work. I think every campus has buildings that need work. But largely, the barriers that students are experiencing and the things that are taking up additional time for them are the navigating ableism that they're encountering with their peers, with their faculty, with offices, assumptions that are built into policies that weren't built to even consider sort of the existence of students with disabilities. And I think it's all of those things. Like I'll share an example of something that we changed a number of years ago at Grinnell, after a student pointed out the issue with it. And I think a lot of campuses have this where Dean's List requires a certain number of credits to even be eligible. Like you have to take 16, 17, beyond sort of a full-time course load in order to be considered for Dean's List. But we also have students who are approved to take fewer credits, like that's part of their accommodation package. And so thinking about, what does it mean to have a policy that right from the get-go says somebody who has an accommodation will never be able to meet sort of this something that students strive for. You know, I think most students would love to be on Dean's List. Like that is a thing that people want to have. You know, and that's just a policy decision. Like there's nothing that says that Dean's List has, like you have to take extra credits in order to be on Dean's List. That's not even sort of built into sort of the ethos of what Dean's List is meant to be in terms of, you know, great performance academically. Like the arbitrary sort of decisions about time to degree, you know, all of these things that kind of are built in as assumptions that like Amanda was talking about of like, what does academics look like? What does being a student mean? What all of those sorts of pieces are arbitrary decisions. And those are things that then students, when they bump up against those, have to navigate, have to advocate for change, have to push, you know, and so all of those are sort of some of the additional pieces, not even to mention the microaggressions that people are experiencing around assumptions about sort of their performance and all of those sorts of things.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts around graduate students, new professionals, you know, maybe who are watching or listening or experiencing this podcast today, but have very little understanding or experience, right? And what resources would you share if folks are listening today and going, I really need to know more about this, but you know, some of the models that we kind of continually interrogate, you know, some of those older theories and older perspectives, like how can we help current higher education professionals advance this complex topic on their campuses and also do the work themselves to advance their own understanding. So resources that you would like to share that you think folks should check out.
Yeah, I would encourage folks, particularly those interested in working with or understanding more about deaf students, is the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes. So they are at the University of Texas, Austin, a grant-based organization that focuses on collecting data around education and work outcomes for deaf individuals across the country. So they have great data that breaks down each of the states and looking at from high school up in terms of high school graduation, some college, meaning community college, 4-year, and then graduate education and above, but also outside of just a great space that has data, but also doing workshops, really great infographics that simply break down how are you engaging with students, right, around either interpreters or transitioning from high school to college, but again, all focused on deaf students and working with their families. I think they've done a really great job of getting in community perspectives, really great videos, and it's run by deaf individuals for deaf individuals. So I think it's a great resource.
Thanks, Alyssa. Other thoughts from either Autumn or Amanda?
So I think that there's a number, depending on what folks are looking for, I think there's a number of great resources out there. I think, you know, kind of with some of the topics that we've been talking about, like some of the resources that I have found really helpful for like really understanding some of these embedded systems and like ableism, like Jay Dolmage's Academic Ableism would definitely be a book that I would recommend for folks. And there's a number of really good books that have come out in the last decade, I would say, about higher ed and sort of looking at more of those sort of systems pieces. I also think it's not higher ed focused, but even for new professionals who feel like they don't have a whole lot of context or understanding about disability as identity, reading Disability Visibility, the edited volume by Alice Wong, I think is also a really good I tend to turn to books for like my own sort of learning. And so I'm kind of putting a couple of those out there for folks who want to do a little more deeper reading on particular things.
Yeah, I was going to recommend those books as well, Autumn, and one more that I'm going to look at, the Disability in Higher Education that Autumn, you were a contributor on, right? So that's, yeah, it's a textbook and I love it. You know, it really breaks down key concepts in a practical way, looking at different aspects of higher ed, but I think it's very relevant to student affairs practice as well. You know, there's a lot of really good disability activism going on. So, I mean, you can kind of turn to social media and Crip Talk and, you know, disability so white, different hashtags that really will give you a sense of the disability rights community and just kind of regular disabled people who are interested in advancing justice. I would say for grad students and for new professionals, and for all of our colleagues, right?
Sure.
Like, we have been taught that disability is is the result of an individual circumstance, right? A physiological difference that needs to be cured or fixed, or some sort of tragedy that we need to pity or position as charity. And that, I would say, is inaccurate. And that there is the reality of impairment. There is the reality of difference in one's body or brain. Disability is bigger than that, right? Disability is a socio-political phenomenon, right, with lots of different implications. So access is not the only piece of disability, right? And that's what, when we really strictly or narrowly interpret the Americans with Disabilities Act, even with the best of intentions, like, that tends to be where we end, is we've made something accessible. But what I think we're all talking about are things like inclusion and microaggressions. And so there are many ways that the disability community, is certainly underrepresented, historically marginalized, subordinated group. And so, we can draw a lot of parallels between the disability experience and those of other subordinated communities. So sometimes I'll just say, like, if you would do it for another group, do it for disability. If you wouldn't do it for another group, don't do it for disability. And like, leave that up to you to kind of reflect on. And that can be about programming. It could be about interactions, about language. But really trying to appreciate that the environment, whether it's the built environment, for me as a chair user, or all of our many other environments, the curricular environment, the policy environment, certainly the digital environment, they have been designed, and through their design, they are inclusive of or exclusive of communities, people, experiences, right? And so it's helpful to think about disability that way, because those environments also shape attitudes. And so if there's not a particular barrier that we can accommodate, or even if there is, right, we can make something very accessible, but that's not touching ableism, right? That's not touching bias. So disability is really complex and interesting. So I would encourage folks to really think differently about it.
Yeah, this is just the beginning, I think, of a much, much bigger conversation. And I know I'd love to continue the conversation beyond today as well with all three of you. As we always kind of end and get to the end, I'd love to hear if there's anything that you wish we would have talked about today, or a topic that you were like, this is something a point I really want to make. And so I'll open it up for that, and then we'll kind of go into final thoughts, if that's good.
It's one thing I'm thinking about. I guess two things come to mind is really the intersectional piece around identity. I think that I highly, highly want to encourage folks of color to engage, connect. I think as a Black person, I've had an interesting relationship with disability, from being a very young child, being diagnosed and really vaguely diagnosed, and then trying to navigate the system with this really vague diagnosis, and kind of constantly having to advocate and push for resources that I needed, but didn't always have this kind of very formal paperwork for, right? And I think that a racialized disabled experience is a very different type of experience, and that we need scholars and graduate students and professionals to connect, right? To come to the table, to engage in the conversation. And I think, again, some of that is kind of riddled with some trauma, perhaps. But for those who are even somewhat interested, like, we so need your perspectives. We so need the research and the work and the thinking that comes with your lived experience that is just missing in so many disabled spaces, particularly within the academy. I don't think that's always the case outside of the academy, but particularly in the academy, it's become a very white experience, and that experience is not everyone's experience. And so as a faculty member, very first day, these are my identities, and it includes disability. Right. And so talking about that lived experience, and I get other students just like, I've never had a professor say that to me. Like, we've got to be more visible, if at all possible, again, right? So I understand the complexities, again, of trauma and how that intersects with race and ethnicity, and it's complicated. But I do think it's a worthwhile conversation, and our scholarship and practice have to become more open to the variety of experiences, again, that we've talked about that come with a racialized lens.
Yeah, and I would add, because I had a very similar thought in thinking about, particularly sort of from my perspective as somebody who works in disability resources and is a white woman, and a lot of folks who do work in higher ed disability spaces are white folks, often white women, and thinking about the ways that we as professionals need to implicate ourselves and the ways that we're envisioning ourselves in policy and in practice, and who that's leaving out. And so, I think particularly for folks who, regardless of what area you're working in, but particularly if you are a grad student or somebody who's thinking about working in disability resources, looking at the ways that ableism and racism have been very intertwined within the academy and without, like, even our legal system, like those two have been so sort of intertwined in terms of the ways that disability and practices around disability, particularly in the K-12 sphere, have been used to resegregate along racial lines. Like, there's all sorts of ways that those have been married, for lack of a better word. And so if folks are looking for readings related to that, I highly recommend some of the work by Subini Anima, looking at some of the discrit work. There's a lot of really good stuff happening in the K-12 sphere in particular that I think higher ed needs to really do more, and particularly white professionals in higher ed need to do more to really be learning and taking in.
Well, I mean, I would say that a lot of people, go into student affairs because they want to help, right? I think we sometimes refer to student affairs as a helping profession, and that does kind of make me uncomfortable because of my experience with disability and how fraught helping is. So I would encourage us, as we think about our work in the field, to think about how we can serve the institution and help the institution become a more inclusive and equitable experience and place, rather than helping every individual disabled student or every individual student, right? We love the relationships that we build with students, and so I'm certainly not suggesting that we don't have them, but I think the greater opportunity to really be kind of progressive student affairs professionals is to really look at how we can change the system and challenge the institution and help the institution in really living out its values around equity and inclusion. And I would just say, if it wasn't really clear earlier, that access and equity are not the same. So when all we're looking at is minimal compliance standards and minimal accommodations, that is not equity. Right? Equity is something that we share. Equity is something that, I think we could argue people have a right to when they're members of a community, and, minimum access is really not where we want to end our work. So really looking at how we can transform our campuses, our programs and practices to ensure that everyone has an equitable experience, right? Including around disability access.
I'm so grateful for all of your contributions today, and I'll just open it up for final thoughts, things that you would like to leave our listeners with that you want to share, or what this conversation has sparked for you now. Sometimes we often ask we're called Student Affairs Now, like, what's on your mind now?
I honestly, I appreciate the conversation. I don't really engage in student affairs spaces very much anymore. And, because I don't necessarily see disability resources work as traditional student affairs, although it can be. But I will say that as a professional, I have felt uncomfortable in student affairs spaces.
Sure.
Because of what I have perceived over 20 years as a student and professional as disability is separate, an insistence on person first language, even when that's not necessarily the preference of the individual. I've just felt over the years that even though there's a lot of good work to do, I don't want to do it, because it's too much for me, right? It's too exhausting and too difficult, right? And so I have really chosen to distance myself from student affairs professional spaces. And I'm surprised I shared that because, this is a, really particular audience, but I'm just saying, I was as student affairsy as they could be, and kind of felt, more and more uncomfortable with, certain conferences and spaces. And so I'm excited to see, perhaps a new reinvigorated conversation about disability. And maybe now's the time, right? Like Lissa was saying, people want it now, right? People are coming to campuses politicized around disability in ways that I haven't seen before, more aware, comfortable, proud of disability. In ways that I really haven't even seen. I mean, even like 5 years ago, wasn't as common. So, maybe things are changing a little bit, but I am excited to be kind of having a different conversation in this space. So thank you.
Oh, I appreciate you naming that. I mean, I think that's the key, right? Is for folks to take a second to think about why that might be, right? And then what are they doing to potentially further those same harms? Thanks, Amanda. Autumn, final thoughts. What are you thinking about now?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm kind of like that didn't come, that I think we talked about or around, but didn't actually like say. And so it's what I'm kind of sitting with, and I think builds off of what Amanda was just sharing. It, is I think that that if there was one thing that people were going to like walk away with is like trust that disabled people know what works well for them. Like trust that disabled people are experts in what works. I think that that's what I run into so much is for myself, but also for like students, faculty, and staff that I'm working with is like a built-in disbelief of like, or disbelief isn't even the right, like an assumption that like, we know what's going to work, like
better.
this type of access, this type of technology, this type of, as opposed to like, oh, I've always used X, like, can I just keep using X? And I think that piece gets left out of the conversation a little bit in terms of like, no, like many of us have been navigating our disabled experience for most, if not all of our lives, and have a lot of ways of knowing sort of what that means for us in different spaces. And I think that that's a part of the piece that needs to be recognized and sort of honored or seen as expertise as well.
Thank you so much. Lissa.
I think I want to go back to the pipeline of folks who have an interest in this area, right? Whether it be through scholarship, whether it be through working in a disabilities cultural center or and disability services, big picture, right? Like, I just want to continue to encourage folks who have any interest that even if your master's or PhD program or institution isn't kind of focused, honoring, or educating around this, that there's lots of resources that you can get information from. That as a faculty member, I'm very used to being contacted from people across the country saying, I'm really interested in this, but I don't have anyone here that's interested. Will you sit on my committee? Not to be afraid to reach out to other campuses to get that mentorship, to get some guidance. I have lots of just kind of sit down chats with people that I love, kind of just brainstorming. Like, that's an interesting dilemma. Let me think. Like, what's happening on your campus? Like, how do you unpack that? People who've read something I've written, and then we get a chance to sit down and have a conversation about it. So I just think that folks who are interested in value and are invested in disabled communities and deaf communities are really open to connecting to people at other campuses, right? To have conversations, to engage in the work, and not to be afraid that, oh, I don't really know enough, or I don't have anyone here that knows enough, so I'll just pick a different topic. Like, you don't have to pick a different topic. I want to encourage you to stick with your topic, stick with your genuine interest of inquiry, right? That we need more people who are thinking outside the box, who are thinking differently, who are thinking futuristic, who are thinking beyond policy and practices we have now, so that we can do different and do better, right? And we're not stuck in this box that the ADA is all we have, and we're just going to keep moving along with, like, there's other ways to think about this, and we need those minds and those perspectives and those lived experiences to be able to do that. So just continue to encourage folks who are at the beginning of the pipeline, in the middle of the pipeline, towards the end of the pipeline, and considering maybe jumping ship, like, stay in the pipeline, stay with us, and engage in the work. And I think there's so much that we have to do. There's so many questions that haven't been asked yet. that we could stay here forever, right? So there's plenty of room
Mhm.
and space for folks, and particularly folks of color, queer folks, like, come on board, come on board, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Mhm.
And particularly folks who have disabilities, come into the pipeline,
Mhm.
right? We do not need only folks who are not in the community studying
Mhm.
and working with the communities, right? So I think as a hearing person who works in and with deaf spaces, like, we need more deaf students, we need more deaf faculty, right? We need more folks with learning disabilities, et cetera, right? Fill in the blank of whatever community. Like, we need folks in the communities to also be doing the work. And so just encourage you to come join, jump in.
I love ending with the call to action. That always is a great kind of send off. And I hopefully folks who are listening today take this as an opportunity. And I really feel like this is the beginning of a broader series of conversations I'd like to host here, because, as we get this overall general perspective, like, I think the nuances and the ways in which we can better kind of delve into some of the specific ways that we could serve our students better, and also create the kind of change we want to see in our institutions. So thank you to the three of you for your good thinking and all of the thoughts that are now swirling around in my head. So just to sign off, finally, sending thanks, of course, to our dedicated behind the scenes work of our production assistant, Nat Ambrosi, who will do all of the work to transcribe this and make sure that's available for folks. And if you are listening today and not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please go to our website, scroll to the bottom, and you can add yourself to our MailChimp list. And then for those folks who are interested in hearing more about our sponsors, today's sponsor first was Leadershape. Leadershape partners with colleges and universities to create transformational leadership experiences, both virtual and in person, for students and professionals, with a focus on creating a more just, caring, and thriving world. Leadershape offers engaging learning experiences on courageous dialogue, integrity, equity, resilience, and community building. And to find out more, please visit www.leadershape.org/virtual programs, or connect with them on any of their social media channels. Second sponsor today is Simplicity, the global leader in student services technology platforms with the state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to the institution, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including, but not limited to, career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success, and accessibility services, incidentally. So important to note that. And to learn more, you can go to their website at simplicity.com. Please take a moment to visit our website again, click on the sponsors link to learn more. Again, I'm Heather Shea. Thanks to our listeners, everyone who's watching and listening today. Make it a great week, everyone.